Hi, this is Christopher Wing, and I am posting my second video online in advance of my upcoming around the world trip to visit every Disney theme park in under 80 hours. But this video is going to be about some of the places I'm not going to go on this trip. So someone online asked me if I was going to be going to Alani on my around the world trip, and I'm not because I'm going to concentrate just specifically on the theme parks on this trip. But if you don't know, Alani is a Disney-owned resort on Hawaii, just outside of Honolulu on Oahu. And it's a really beautiful place. But it did get me thinking about other places that I'm not going to be going to either. And there's kind of a couple different categories of those, one of which are places that Disney just never got around to actually building. Some of the most famous examples can actually be found at Epcot Center. This is a guidebook from before the park actually opened, so there's lots of stuff in here that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore or never got built in the first place. But some of my favorite parts are concerning World Showcase. So if you know Epcot, you'll know that the front section is called Future World, and the back section has all these little country pavilions called World Showcase. And there's lots of kind of empty plots or spaces in between some of these pavilions where they could add more. And in fact, they have added two after the park opened. Morocco was added afterwards, and so was Norway. So a lot of people thought, well, maybe they'll just keep adding more countries. And for a while, it looked like they might, but unfortunately, they haven't built any since Norway. And of course, now the Norway Pavilion is getting rethemed into kind of a Arendelle, Anna and Elsa thing. And a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about how that's going to go. But what I was really interested in this book is the fact that in the back they say coming soon to World Showcase, and then they have three countries in particular that they highlight here: Israel, Equatorial Africa, and Spain. And the descriptions on these are actually pretty kind of amusing. The Israel one is pretty straightforward, but for Spain, it says, take a spectacular journey through Spain by film to little-known and out-of-the-way vacation Edens. And then it goes on to talk about the food. In a waterside restaurant, indulge in tapas, or Spanish-style finger food, a blend of varied ingredients, but suitable to simple tastes. And I just think that's pretty funny. Simple tastes, because that's what you want in a theme park, I guess. In the Equatorial Africa section, that's even more interesting. It talks about how you're going to go on a safari through a world of natural beauty and adventure, and there's going to be a Heartbeat of Africa show, swaying to the jungle beat of music and dance. And then finally it says, Alex Haley, the noted author of Roots, is your guide for Africa Rediscovered, an adventure uncovering Africa's ancient cultural heritage. And I don't know about you, but that sounds fantastic. I would have loved to see an Alex Haley, narrated show about the history of Africa. The African Pavilion was the closest of any of those three to actually getting built. If you go to Epcot now and you take the pathway that leads in between China and Germany, there's a little area there with some kind of African sort of huts and an old safari jeep, but unfortunately right now it's just a snack location that sells candy and soda pop. This is a guidebook for Epcot from what is this, 1991, and if you look here at the map, right in between China and Germany, there's a tiny print there that says Refreshment Outpost. And unfortunately, that's all that ever got built of the African Pavilion in Epcot. Years later, of course, they built an entire Africa land in Animal Kingdom, and I think once that happened, that was kind of the nail in the coffin for them ever continuing to build any more Africa pavilions in Epcot, just because they didn't want to have two Africa sections, two different theme parks. But who knows, maybe someday. When it comes to things that Disney planned or announced but never actually built, one of the really most famous ones is called Disney's America. This was a planned theme park that they were going to build outside of Manassas, Virginia, which is a little bit outside of Washington, D.C. And it was going to be a celebration of the history of America, both the good parts and the bad parts. And it's going to be a lot more kind of educational than most of their other theme parks. The problem was, and you can see here, where they were going to build it was basically right adjacent to a historical Civil War battlefield, and a lot of people didn't think it was really appropriate to be ripping up Civil War battlefields in order to build a Disney theme park, no matter how reverential it would have been to the surrounding area. So unfortunately, it really never had much of a chance of getting off the ground. But I do love this brochure. If you open it up, there's some absolutely gorgeous concept artwork of the park, as well as some of the rides, and then the actual layout of the whole area that they were intending. But the part that I'm most interested in is actually the descriptions and pictures of some of the rides, because there's an interesting kind of legacy at Disney where a good idea never really dies. So they had some really good ideas for Disney's America, and when that park didn't come to fruition, the ideas for attractions within the park got reused later on elsewhere, particularly at California Adventure next to Disneyland. So if you look very closely, you'll see there's a river raft ride called the Lewis and Clark Expedition that looks very, very similar to Grizzly River Run. There's a section called Victory Field that looks very, very similar to Condor Flats. And there's a section called Crossroads USA that looks somewhat similar to the Pacific Wharf section of California Adventure. So it's just kind of interesting to see how those ideas end up getting reused and rethemed in other ways later on, even if the park that contained them originally never got off the ground. There's a whole other section of places that I won't be going on this trip, not because they didn't get built, but because they were built and unfortunately are no longer available for your enjoyment. So here's a Walt Disney World souvenir guidebook from the mid to late 1980s. And if I flip to the back, I can see an example of something that you really can't go to anymore, which is called River Country. So River Country was Disney's first attempt at doing a water slide kind of water theme park. And it was built right adjacent to Bay Lake, and primarily to service the Fort Wilderness campground, which is still there. But in any event, I love this picture, though, of River Country because it kind of encapsulates a lot of the problems that it had and the reason why it no longer exists. First of all, of course, it had a capacity problem. It was a very, very small water park that was really just built for the campground and became much more popular than it was originally intended to be. The other problem is that the water, and you can see this in the picture, and I love this because it's Disney's actual publicity shot here that they're using. I mean, look at the water. It looks pretty murky and disgusting. You can see that it's actually connected into Bay Lake, and that was a big problem because it turned out that Bay Lake, as with many waterways in Florida, has a brain-eating amoeba that lives in it, which if it goes up your nose and gets in your brain, could actually kill you. So the idea of swimming in the lake water, probably not such a good idea after all. They probably could have found ways around that, kept the park open, but instead Disney decided to build two new water theme parks, Typhoon Lagoon and Blizzard Beach, which had a much greater capacity and also weren't connected to any lake water. So it kind of solved all their problems, and so River Country eventually went by the wayside. There are some locations in Disneyland that still kind of exist, but not really in their original format. So right here I have an example of a copy of Walt Disney World News, and this was during an anniversary of Mickey Mouse, so they built a special land called Mickey's Birthday Land. And it was supposed to be this sort of temporary thing, but it actually ended up sticking around for quite some time. So if you look at sort of guidebooks throughout the ages, so here's one from 1988, and if you open it up, if you open it up, you can see right there next to Fantasyland, it says Mickey's Birthday Land, right? Simple enough. Then you open a guidebook from a few years later. This is from 1991. Open it up, and it's still there, but the name has changed to Mickey's Starland. Okay, so it stays around. Then we have a couple years later, this is 1998. The map, unfortunately, getting a little bit cheesier and harder to open. And you can see now the name has changed to Mickey's Toontown Fair. And another thing you may notice is that the Nautilus 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea attraction next door is gone, but the water is still there. For a while it was just Ariel's Grotto. It was sort of a meet and greet area for Ariel until they figured out what to do with the space. Now moving on a little bit later, this is 2004, guidebook here. Now it's still a fold-out map. Open this up, and you can see now that it's still Mickey's Toontown Fair, but lo and behold, the waterway next to Fantasyland has now completely disappeared. And as we know, eventually they rethemed this whole area. They did build a Little Mermaid attraction on that spot, and Mickey's Toontown Fair eventually became Mickey's Storybook Circus, and got kind of just incorporated into the rest of Fantasyland. So that's an example of a place that still technically exists, but not really in the way it originally did. Here's a place that also still technically exists, but not in the way that it originally did, the Disney Institute. The story goes that Michael Eisner, who was the head of the Disney company at that time, went to a retreat at the Chautauqua Institute in New York, and he liked it so much he said, "Oh, let's build something like that." But the idea was originally that instead of just going on a vacation where you just go to theme parks, you would go on a vacation where you actually learn something, and you would actually take classes. And there are all these different classes that you can take. It's almost like a college course catalog here. And they range from things like gardening to personal wellness to filmmaking to audio recording, all sorts of weird, crazy stuff that you can do. I have a few favorites though. For example, they have a section in here that is, as the Disney World turns, 4 hours, take the fate of soap opera characters in hand and decide their actions in the next episode of As the Disney World Turns, where you bring your story to life for Disney Institute listeners. Can you imagine that, where you actually have to write a show and put it on for everybody else at the resort? That'd be kind of intimidating, actually. They have another section here where they talk about self-defense aerobics, where I guess you learn martial arts essentially in order to do self-defense, although I don't know how that really hooks up with aerobics, but okay. And they have, finally, they have one hooked on hydroponics, and you explore the technology of hydroponic gardening, and probably the less said about that, the better. Unfortunately, it turns out that when people go to Walt Disney World for a vacation, they aren't really looking to take college-type courses while they're there, especially if they have to pay quite substantial sums for them. So unfortunately, the Disney Institute never really became a thing like Michael Eisner wanted it to, and eventually got rethemed into the Saratoga Springs Resort, where they pretty much ripped out everything except the hotel part and the spa. But one last thing I'll talk about very briefly is something that I loved when I was a kid growing up. Now, there are a ton of sites devoted to so-called extinct attractions. My personal favorite one is called yesterland.com, and it's run by a guy named Werner Weiss, who I've met a few times and is a really wonderful guy. But my personal favorite example of an attraction that unfortunately no longer exists is Monsantos Adventure Through Inner Space. And this was a little booklet that came out to kind of entice you into the idea of this ride. So originally what you do is you would get into a little car and you would be shrunk down to the size of an atom using this thing called the mighty microscope. And then you'd ride in your little atom car through various scenes. You go through the heart of an atom and into a snowflake, and there would be a big creepy eye at the end that would be looking at you. I don't know, it was just goofy fun. I love this ride so much. Unfortunately, they took it out to build Star Tours. But the interesting thing is Disney loves to kind of pay homage to the attractions that came before. So if you ride Star Tours now and you look really, really close, it's almost gone in the blink of an eye, but you can actually see the mighty microscope actually hidden inside of the Star Tours film. So next time you ride it, keep an eye open for it. So that's all I'm going to talk about in this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll post probably one more before it's time for me to actually embark on my journey, where I'll be posting quicker, shorter videos as I progress along the way. But But for now, that's all, and I'll see you next time.